Welcome, everybody. We are going to be working on Unit 4 today, and in Unit 4, we are going to be moving into Razer. I am starting with my face on the screen, and I'm not really a huge fan of doing my videos that way because it also wastes screen space. So I'm going to mute my camera while I'm recording and then turn it on, as we need. So I hope you guys are cool with that. But here goes the mute. And hopefully you get something other than my silly little profile picture here. Basically, our goal for today is to learn about this technology called Razer inside of .NET that is used for app development and web page development in ASP.NET Core. It's been around for a while, and let's actually take a look at our topic list here. So I'm going to do first a comparison between some of the user interface choices that you have in .NET Core, and then focusing on Razer because I feel that it's probably one of the more important ones. Not that the other ones aren't important also, but in terms of this platform, it seems to be the primary tool. They are pushing a newer tool called Blazor as well. And they also make special note of the single page approach of JavaScript frameworks and the MVC approach. And we're going to start touching upon MVC a little bit because it becomes necessary when you're working with data. And we're going to learn a bunch of really important concepts here. It's like pretty heavy conceptually here today, but also we get to use the stuff so you see what it does. And without a significant amount of effort, we get a lot working pretty quickly. All right, so what I'd like to do is I have this all tied in basically to Microsoft pages that have, basically reference materials about all this. And I think Microsoft has done a very good job with this, by the way. And to the point where I'm thinking maybe for future iterations of this course, I might forego the textbook altogether. We'll see. I'm still kind of like wrestling with that book a little bit. But I am finding this Microsoft stuff very, very useful. The first thing I am going to make note of is since I did an upgrade to my Visual Studio, and I assume that most of my students who started here in this, May or June of 2024 here, probably have a version of Visual Studio that supports .NET 8. I'm sticking with the .NET 8 stuff for now because after my upgrade of Visual Studio, it's included. I don't see any reason not to use the modern frameworks. I'm not seeing any major differences between 7 and 8, at least for the stuff that we're doing. What they're kind of pointing out here is as you're starting to actually build web apps, you get into this situation where you have choices as to what interface you're going to use to build or what user interface components you're going to use to build your web app. And they talk about the technologies that you see listed here. So we'll talk about Blazor, which is this new thing, and I think they're trying to push it real strong, which is why it's up at the top, followed by Razer, which is what we're going to work on today. We'll also look at MVC, which is a common architecture in a lot of app building, both for the web and for regular development. And then what we call SPAs, or the single page applications, usually where you use a front-end JavaScript framework like Angular or React or Vue or one of those types of tools. The other option too is that you can do a blend of different stuff, and you notice like one hybrid solution that they show listed here is that you can do MVC, combine it with Razer or Blazor to kind of push an app. And I think that's actually pretty common when you're doing Razer stuff. And once again, we're going to be kind of touching on some of that today, right? We're not going deep into view control. In fact, we're not going into view control or controllers really at all, right? Really what we're going to be looking at is a modeling data so that we can read and write data to a local database to run an app. So in other words, to have data created, have it persist, be able to create, retrieve, update, and destroy all the CRUD operations. All right. So which framework you choose really starts to become kind of dependent on what you're trying to achieve somewhat, right? So most of the time when we're thinking about real proper app development, the fact that you can have stuff that is built into a framework. So for example, if I build an app that's got a menu system, I don't want to have to recreate that menu system all the time. I just want to be able to take my content and inject it into the page structure where the navigation and the footer and all the little components and the basic view of the page is already handled, right? And we don't want to like mess with it. So the reusability becomes really, really important. Um, Blazor is kind of a newer technology, and they are pushing it really hard here. You know, you can see some of the features that it has, and rather than spend a lot of time talking about it, I'm just going to kind of put the screen up here, take a look at it. This is what it offers. And I think that, you know, Microsoft obviously wants us to utilize this, but I don't see that there's a lot of professional development at this point happening in this sphere. That may change. All right, let's move on to the Razer pages. Razer's pages have been around for quite a while now, and Razer pages do have their own syntax, by the way. And I did put a link in the topics for the unit to a syntax guide, and we're going to take a look at that as we kind of flow through the tutorial. And I have a tab open with it right now. Okay, I'll tell you what, generally speaking, when we're working with Razer, how do you know you're working with Razer? Because you start seeing these @ signs in your code, basically. And so that's kind of a tip that Razer's kind of at play. Now, one of the benefits of using Razer, as they indicate here, is that it's really pretty quick and easy to either build your UI or update your UI without changing a lot of code for the page. And it allows you to keep basically the graphical portion, like what it looks like, separate from what we call the logic behind the scenes, right? And in a .NET application, and the way that we're kind of working with stuff, what you are going to see is that we're going to have basically what are HTML files, even though they have different file extensions on them. And then we'll have code files attached to each one of those. And then we also have like the master program file, which kind of steers the whole application. So it keeps user interface and business logic, as they're putting it here, separate. And I think that's helpful. You know, apparently it scales really well. You know, so if you deploy on, you know, platforms like Azure, for example, that this allows you to do some scaling without a lot of effort. And it also allows you to kind of organize your pages. You know, what they're saying is simpler than if you use the MVC approach. And MVC can get kind of complicated, right? Because you're working with a lot of moving parts and pieces. And notice what they're saying here is that you can see specific logic and view models together, right, in their own namespace and directory. And it takes pages that are kind of related to each other, and then they're kept in their own little directories and stuff. And we're going to kind of tinker with that a little bit, so you get tiny, like I said, a tiny flavor of it today. They also kind of look at the MVC model. And the MVC model is one that's been around a long time. And it's kind of like the original kind of approach for what we call, I think the way that a lot of people talk about it is separation of concerns. Oh, yeah, they have it highlighted here, right? Which means that when you're working with an application, your application often breaks down into various areas that have their own kind of like logical underpinning. So for example, the part that we're going to look at today, the model part, and we learned about this a little bit last week, is that we can create class files within our application that set the framework of how we're going to deal with the data that we're reading and writing to the external source, whether it's a database or a text file or whatever, right? It doesn't really matter what that is, but the model sets the structure for that, like what format we're following, basically. A view obviously controls like what is pushed out to the browser, and controllers are pieces of program code that look at what actions are happening in your app and kind of steers the whole application, including what data models you're working with, what views you're pushing to, what content is pushed to those views. And this has been going on for a while. So people have been using this approach for decades now, you know, successfully. And the one problem with it, though, is it can get kind of complicated to work with. And that's why, like, if you start out with programming, we don't like throw you into MVC because it's kind of like, deep end of the pool with sharks in it, kind of thing. It is complicated. It can be difficult, both conceptually and functionally, right? So it helps to kind of have a good, strong programming background first, and to have a good web background first before you start messing with stuff like that. There are some technologies, and I think the one I mentioned before is we used to teach here at Gateway Ruby on Rails, where Ruby is a programming language, Rails is a framework that's set on top of that language, and those two in combination, working with an MVC pattern, was very popular. I'm going to say 10 plus years ago for building content management systems and dynamic websites and apps for mobile, because of that separation of concern. So in other words, if I design an interface, I don't have to recreate it every time I want to do a thing. I just reuse that interface, inject my content into it, use a data model to interface with the database, et cetera, right? So this is also a technique that's still heavily used, and it does overlap, once again, what we're doing today just a little bit. The other approach, of course, is working with single page apps. And if you guys have taken maybe the React class here or the Angular class when it did exist, or the Web Frameworks class, where I think if you take that Web Frameworks class, and if you haven't taken it yet, you'll probably do Angular and Vue in that class, is kind of my guess. It's not one I usually teach, but I am, instrumental in helping it kind of get rolling, so I know what's inside of it. The one, advantage of using these frameworks is a lot of big companies and enterprise organizations use these technologies. So one really good example is here within our district. We have Uline Corporation, the big like packaging supply company. And I know for a fact that they spin up most of their internal applications through Angular. So they're basically web-facing applications. They have a web front end, and they interface with databases on the back end, which might be internal to the organization. And they usually containerize stuff as well. So on top of Docker and Kubernetes. Also separate fields of study. But the whole point is that these front-end frameworks have basically these little modules that you build that allow you to interact with your application on the back end. So they create these beautiful looking little tools on the front end, forms, I don't know, various interaction components, and then that's driving back end logic. So very common. These are probably the three most popular ones for doing that type of work. But there are many others, right? So that's the other thing. Blazor, by the way, would be a tool that you would add to this list because it's basically the same type of tool, right? It really is designed more for the front end development. So that's why they call it front end JavaScript frameworks. I don't know, that those are a possibility for sure, right? So a lot of people do work within .NET and then throw in those frameworks on top. That is very common. So what is that driven by? By the organization you're working for, basically. It is also possible to kind of combine these technologies, and the one they're really trying to push you to combine here are taking MVC, which you might already have an app that's built on that, and then you're adding Razer and Blazor to it. And I would say that if you have an MVC app, you can probably pretty easily add one of the other frameworks on top of it too, be it Angular, React, or Vue, or what have you, right? All right, so let's move on then. And what they're where we're going to go to next is basically this tutorial that is linked up in the assignment. So like if you bop through the content here in Unit 4, there's no videos yet. I'm recording it still, so there's nothing there to share. But we're going to attempt to get through this today. That's my goal. I originally was hoping to go through all of it, and then I started realizing, oh wait, this goes a little bit deeper and is a little heavier than we can do in one day. So I split it into 2 assignments, and if we can get up through this, I will be super happy. So let's not waste time and let's get into it. The first thing you want to do of course, is you want to click through the tutorial. I would throw it up on screen number 2 if you have a screen number 2. The link is right there. I'll try to share that in the video YouTube post or whatever when I get to that point. I do make the note here that I am using the version 8 libraries, once again, as I mentioned, because I did upgrade my Visual Studio. But if you don't have version 8, use 7. All of the techniques they're showing here should work just fine in 7. All right. All right, so that's kind of the lay of the land as to where we're going. So here we are on the tutorial page here. We have some stuff to do. You can see all my purpled out links here, which is this is how far I got today, which was my tip for like, hey man, if I can't get through all of these today, then probably should split it up into 2. I did make it all the way through those first 5 sections though. But if you just take a look at like what we're going to do here, so we're first going to build an app using a template. So it'll be kind of like we did like that first week where you launch a template, you hit the run button, and voila, you have a website and it works, right? And it's pretty cool, right? And then we are going to add a model. We started tinkering with that a little bit too, and then we're going to learn a brand new thing called scaffolding, and how that is super, super powerful. You can combine it with a data model that you can auto build a whole bunch of pages with a few clicks. Really kind of cool. And then we will kind of interface a little bit with the database, and we'll show you those pieces that, where they are, where they sit in place, and how it all connects together. The first thing I will tell you, and this is an important thing, right? So the people who maybe have SQL Server running locally on their machine. So I do get those students that take certain courses within our programs. Like, for example, if you're in the web program, you take the database course. Depending on when you took it and who taught you, you either learned how to do databases on MySQL, and that's really our preference in web because that's mostly what we use in web, right? Unless you're doing .NET, or you did it on SQL Server. If you went through the process of installing SQL Server on your machine, and it's running resident in the background, here's my tip. Visual Studio will attach to the running instance of SQL Server rather than the local development database that usually happens within this process of building an app through Visual Studio locally, right? It is not normal for people to run SQL Server on their local laptop. And in fact, if you are running it, I would strongly suggest you might consider not running it, right? Because it does chew up system resources and it runs actively in the background all the time. How do you know if you have it? Well, you go to your task manager, and I usually choose to go to services, and then I think it's listed as like MS SQL Server or something. And you can see I don't have it listed here. But if I did, it's somewhere here in the M's, it's like MS SQL Server or something and I think if I'm not mistaken, it's all caps, right? And if you see that it's listed and running, you can stop it. And then more importantly, you can set up that service so it doesn't auto start every time and chew up memory. If you have it there, your system runs fine and you're okay with it, just roll with it. It'll attach to that database instead. Otherwise, you will attach to a local database, which, I tend to prefer for doing development work. Personal take on things. I'm just informing you in advance. All right, so basically what we're going to end up building here is we're going to build a website that allows us to create a movie database where we can do all the CRUD operations. So in other words, we will be able to add movies to the database, edit them once they're in there, pull up the details once they're in there, and then also remove them from the database if we wish. That's kind of the grand goal. You can see like there's links, a list of content, so you can create new, edit, get the details, and delete. And those are basically the CRUD operations. And then they also have like filtering and searching that eventually happens too. I haven't gotten that far in the tutorial yet, but those are features that we add. Right? So that's kind of what the app will look like. All right. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go over to the next little link here, right? So we're in the get started section right now. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we have the stuff that we need to get started. So, my students, you guys are okay, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to do any of your work anyhow. But basically, you have to make sure ASP.NET Web Development are installed in your Visual Studio. And then we're going to go ahead and create a new project. So that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to go ahead and fire up Visual Studio here. So of course it goes to screen number 2, shows that I've been kind of working it all day. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. Now, you will notice when I hit that button, I've been tinkering with it today. So it is on my recent project templates, and I could just click on that and go. If it's not, then you want to do some filtering here. So the first thing I would say is C#. The other thing I would say is web, right? And then if you scroll down here, the one that we're looking for is ASP.NET Core Web App Razer Pages, and you notice how it's also multi-platform and designed for the web. All right, so that's the one you want, and go ahead and click next. Now they do tell us to name it a very particular way, so we may as well pay attention to that and enter Razer Pages Movie as the title. And maybe I should just kind of leave it like that and type it in. So Razer Pages Movie, right? And it says it's important to name it, including matching the capitalizations to the namespaces will match when you copy your code, right? If you name this anything even remotely different, anywhere you're copying their code may have that highlighted text in there. You're going to have to change it to whatever you named it. So it makes sense to name it exactly the same. Now, when I did the tutorials earlier today, I named it something different on purpose, but I knew how to work around it. So I just want to give you that heads up. I am working with a local storage location. So I'm just letting it store where Visual Studio wants to store it on my own hard drive. As we talked about before, sometimes if you're using cloud drives, that can create some problems as the files are syncing. So better to go local, or if you have a GitHub, you can push to GitHub too, whatever. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click next on this. And then we're just going to take the defaults. I am leaving HTTPS checked. Why? Because that's how they're doing it, and I don't really want to differ from what they're doing. Also going with the .NET 8 version since I have it. Otherwise, go to .NET 7. And then all the other checkboxes should be unchecked. Only HTTPS should be checked. Right? We're not really adding authorization at this point, so it's actually fairly lightweight. All right, so go ahead and click create. All right, and then here on my other screen, it is doing the build. And since I've been running Visual Studio, I mean, it was almost instantaneous for me. At most, it should like run that little scroll box for, like 10, 20 seconds or so. And if you have an older machine, it might take up to a minute for it to actually build. So let's go back to the instructions then. So we have the project created, and then they're kind of showing us the folder structure. So we're going to go into Visual Studio and take a look, but it does create a whole bunch of different files here within Visual Studio, right? So you can look at all the different folders it creates. So connected services, dependencies, properties, the www root folder, which we know that's where static stuff goes, like images or static HTML files. And then we have the pages area, which I am going to expand here. I think this one will probably be empty, well, relatively empty. So they have a favorites icon. They have some default CSS, JavaScript, and a bunch of other things already sitting there waiting for you to use. And I just want you to notice that Bootstrap, right, which is basically a CSS templating system, jQuery, both the regular jQuery and the validation pieces are all kind of added in automatically. Why? Because they're so commonly used, right? Do you have to use Bootstrap? No. Should you use Bootstrap? Well, hey, it looks good and you don't have to tweak the code much. I say go with it. You know, that's kind of my approach. If you want to look at the CSS file, you can click on it. There's not really a lot in here, but where the basic look of the site comes from would be from that CSS file. And then there's a site.js, which has nothing in it yet because we haven't created anything for it. All right. If you want to dig into those other libraries, they're there, but whenever you see libraries like this, like Bootstrap, jQuery, the validation, the unobtrusive, those are all NuGet packages, right? So like if you created a blank Razer page project without a template, you could add those things in if you want them, right? Microsoft considers it so standard, they're just automatically included. So it tells you something about those technologies. That's kind of like go with it is really kind of the suggestion. In the pages folder, you're going to notice first there's a bunch of different types of files. Yes, there's an index file, but you'll notice right away there is this .cs HTML, so C# HTML file extension. And now I want you to keep in mind here, when we hit this in the browser, you don't see that file extension at all, right? It creates different URLs for us. But really what that means is we have basically an HTML file. Remember I told you that @ indicates Razer syntax. So there's some Razer syntax automatically kind of dropped in here, right? And that's all Razer stuff, the purple stuff with the @ in front of it. And then it looks like basic HTML, but your brain should tell you, like, hey, where's the doc type? Where's the HTML tag? Where's the body tag? You know, yada, yada. That's elsewhere, right? Attached to every index.cs or every CS HTML file, of course, is a CS file that goes behind it. Usually there's not much loaded in there, right? But every page like that, using Razer syntax, basically is going to have one attached. And then there's an error page. So there's basically like if they're not finding it, the error page is pre-created. There's also a privacy page, which is content that, you know, assuming you're going to have a privacy policy, you can basically add your privacy policy here in regular HTML format, and there it is, right? So you don't have to create it, pre-created for you. Thank you, Microsoft, right? Now, the other thing that you're going to start to see are these underlines, and these underlines have a special meaning. In other words, they're kind of like template files of sorts, or what we call partial files, right? If we look inside the share folder, if you're wondering where do we get our basic page structure from, it comes from the shared folder. We're going to review all this as we kind of go through the tutorials. But if you click on in the shared folder and underscore layout, and then you go, oh, there's my doc type, there's my HTML tag, there's my head. Notice that the head tag's got all the stuff you're supposed to have in there, including the viewport set to 1, a title tag, which is somewhat dynamically generated, links to Bootstrap, RCSS, and another CSS file that we haven't really had, you know, added anything yet to, but it's all linked up already, set to go. And then there's also a structure. You notice that they have a kind of a header and a navigation area. They have kind of like the container where the page content goes, and then a footer at the bottom that has more stuff that you could always customize. And then the way bottom, which is pretty common for a lot of JavaScript frameworks, is you load up your HTML first, and then you trigger scripts to load up, you know, jQuery and JavaScript and stuff after the page content loads, right? So links here to jQuery, Bootstrap, and our own JavaScript. Then there's, you know, these like weird little Razer directives that you're going to see peppered in here, including in the container where we have this like main tag, right? Very common to put your page content into a main tag on a page. And it just has a Razer directive to render the body. We don't know what that is yet. The Razer code is going to create that. So in other words, what happens is when you hit a page, it comes here, it grabs the layout, and then depending on which page you're hitting, it'll grab that page, run whatever code's attached to it, and then feed all the content. So in other words, this stuff, whatever this stuff does, is then fed into basically this area of the layout page, right? So it's kind of like a template. If you want to do a comparison to other technologies, a really good comparison would be, for example, if you were doing PHP and you are including content, right? And but this time we're going backwards, you know. So here we are. This is the template level, right? And this template is injected into all the pages. And then the content is basically included from whatever the page is. So this is like, if I'm calling the index page, it reads this file, does whatever this says, and pulls the stuff in, right? And then writes the HTML for you, and then pushes it out to the browser. So conceptually, that's kind of what's happening here. All right. So that gives you an idea of like how the technology is all kind of stitched together. They want you to look at it and understand, right? The other thing is they want you to run the app. So we're going to do a clean build. The one thing I do want to point out, and I'm going to highlight it here on the screen, is there's two different ways to run apps, right? So the one is you just go into Visual Studio and you hit the run button, and then all these like panels open up in here and these like monitors and whatever. And basically what's happening is it's running a control panel that shows you, hey, like it shows you what's going on as it's happening, and it's pretty useful. But a lot of times you just want to propagate the stuff to the screen. And so often when you look at a lot of these, you know, .NET tutorials or things, they'll tell you to run it without debugging, right? So if I click this would be the equivalent of hitting F5. If I want to run it without debugging, then I do Control F5. So I'm going to go ahead and run this right now. And I think, you know, if you're not clicked in here, I like to be somewhere on the root of the project and then go Control F5. So this is going to build. It's going to launch into the browser, and here is the page, right? So this is a clean build of what we just did. What did I put in here? Like basically nothing, right? And this is just all automatically created. This is the index page running on top of the local internal web server of Visual Studio, right? So as long as this is working, you know, now you have a clean build, as we say, and a good starting point. I don't know if they're really having us do anything inside of here. I don't think so. They also give you the SSL warning. So if you haven't accepted your own SSL certificate, you can do these steps here to kind of bypass having to do it every time. All right. Now they go through the process now of explaining all this stuff. I want you to notice one thing before I carry on here. The first thing is when I did a Control F5, this thing, it doesn't have a stop button, right? And as long as that original propagated web page is open, and let's say I navigate around it, right, and go to the privacy page, come to the home page, it's running off of that build I did when I did Control F5. So if I change the files, that's not going to be reflected, right? But clicking and stopping this doesn't have to stop the internal server from running. It's already stopped. It just ran once and it was in memory, right? That's kind of the difference. It also isn't necessarily giving you the debug errors if there's compiled code that's having problems. But generally, when you're doing a lot of stuff within Visual Studio like this, and you just want to get the stuff up on the screen and see how it looks or what it's doing, that's a better approach, right? Our previous textbook was always like Control F5, like every time, you know, because otherwise you get these weird messages and you're trying to contend with them that you don't really have to worry about them. All right, back to the content. All right, so they start, you know, having you look at all the files. So once again, we looked at the CS/HTML files, right? We also, you know, why do you have the CS in there? Because when you're adding Razer to it, it needs that file extension to be able to be seen as C# code and work. And then we still have a C# file attached to the back end of that. And if you want, you know, once again, to look at, you know, any of these, right? So I'll just look at index, but that has a backend, you know, C# file, right? Not much in it, whatever's default. So that's pretty typical. We talked about the layout page and how that's used to kind of control the general appearance of the site. So if I wanted to change the framework of how the site looks, that's where I would do it. If I want to not use Bootstrap, not use jQuery, any of that stuff, that's where I would remove it from. And yeah, it's possible to totally go in there, write your own custom code, custom CSS, whatever, and run with that. Once again, the www root is all for static files, HTML, JavaScript, CSS files. And then all the settings for the application are stored in the app settings.json file, which you find basically down here in the root. And you can look at that and you can see not really a lot in there right now, right? All right, so that's kind of the lay of the layout. Now they want us to take a look at the Program.cs file. So let's just go ahead and humor it and click on there. You can look at the code. Not too dissimilar from some of the stuff that we've been looking at already. So we still have the builder thing going on, but you'll notice that we have this directive, which is to add Razer pages. So we're adding that capability. It also has the exception handler or error handler for being in development mode, right? And this is something that we have talked about already. So in other words, like if you run this in production mode, this is a piece that you usually remove, right? So during development, you leave it so you get your error messages. For production, you remove it. You will also notice a couple of other things here. So HTTPS redirection, static fields, routing, authorization, and then another one that's important for doing Razer, which is mapping Razer pages. So those are things that are automatically added by choosing the template that we did, right? They are not asking us to change any of this at this point. They start explaining what some of the stuff does. So like when we are adding the add Razer pages piece, that supports what we call dependency injection. In other words, it allows us, so in other words, we connect to Razer and then Razer can inject stuff in our pages is kind of a simplistic way to look at it. Right. Once again, they talk about that if statement and handling errors, right? And we've already talked about that too, just a few seconds ago. And then they also talk about all the different middleware that they're enabling here and what it does, right? So use HTTPS redirection. If somebody types in HTTP in front of the URL, it automatically switches it to HTTPS. Pretty standard on a web host, by the way. Use static files so that we can use the stuff in that static file folder. The use routing. In other words, so if we are setting up middleware, we can use the routing pieces to direct traffic based upon the URL typed. The Razer pages allows for the Razer stuff to work. Authorization, of course, if we want to add logins and stuff. And then, of course, the run runs it. So that was the first step. Let's just do a quick pause here. All right, seems like everybody's doing all right. So I'm moving on to part 2 now. And in this part, we're going to add a model to basically be able to work with some data within our application. Now, they make this special little note here, and it says that, usually when we're working with a database, we get deep into this tool that in the Microsoft, area of development called the entity framework. That allows us to work with databases, right? And while that's all cool, it can get pretty complex and can cause a lot of problems, especially for people first delving into it, right? And it can get pretty complex. But if you are working with live production databases, even during the development process, that tool would become necessary, right? And we're not quite ready yet for that, but it's coming, right? Now, what we're going to do instead is we're going to use what we call, what they're calling POCO classes or plain old CLR objects. So we don't have to rely on the entity framework to do the work, but when we do this, right, so this is part of this MVC thing, is we're going to build that data model, which sets the template for how we're moving the data back and forth from the database and how we'll interact within the application. All right, so let's follow the steps here to add a data model. And so it says in Solution Explorer, right-click the project node, and then add a new folder and call that folder models with a capital M. And why do we use that? Because that's the standard for when you're working with data models. So I'm just going to right click here. I'm going to choose add. I'm going to choose new folder, and I will call it models, plural, capital M, and then I'm going to press enter to lock it in. So it should look like that when you're done. Then it says right click that folder and add a class file and name the class movie. Now, of course, we're working with C#, so the class file that we're going to add is going to be a C# class file. And for me, the easiest way to add it is just what I did. I'm right clicking on that folder, choosing add, and then choosing class. If it doesn't appear here, then you have to like go to the new item thing and find the class file, but it should appear for all of you, right? Just make sure you're in C#. It's just a plain old class file. And then they wanted us to call it movie singular. Now, let me talk about that for just a second, because when we build this data model, we're building a model of the data relative to one singular movie, which is why we name it in a singular fashion, right? I don't want to call this movies because I'm not going to be setting up the data structure for multiple movies. I'm calling it movie because I'm setting up the data structure for a singular movie, and I hope that resonates. All right. They do have some sample code here, right? So the first thing is they want this using statement. So I'm going to grab that using statement, and that's going to go above the namespace declaration here. So I'm just pasting it in. I'll zoom in just a little bit so you can see it better. Right, so we're pasting that in. And then here between the curly brackets of the class movie, we will then add these data fields. So this would be akin to like if you're building an object in an object-oriented programming language of just setting up all the private data fields. You can see these are all set to public. Notice we're going to have an ID field, a title, a release date, a genre, and a price. Other things to note here that are interesting. When we do data fields, like if you want to compare to Java, right? So I might have some of you that are taking the Java 2 class right now because it's also going on. When we create data fields for a class object in Java, we usually do getters and setters as separate methods in the class declaration. So in other words, we declare the data type and the name and whether it's public or private. And then farther down in the code, we'll have like a, get ID or set ID, and it'll have like a script for what you do when that happens. And that's how Java does it. And C#, they were like, well, let's just throw this in there. And that just means you can get and set this property, right? So we can get the information and we can set the information. We do declare a data type. So the ID is going to be an integer. And then we have other data types. So the title is going to be a string, but then I'll have you notice that there's a question mark after it, right? And what that technically means in C# is that the value is, I think the correct terminology is nullable, right? So in other words, we can provide content of null or nothing, and it won't fail. And you'll notice that 2 of the strings here are that way. So like the genre and the title of the movie are nullable, meaning I can technically enter blank information and not have it crash, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing to watch for. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that notice that they have these like square bracketed code here that usually refers to the one that follows, right? So that's kind of the format for it. And what they're doing here is they're setting up a data type, and we're only looking for the date. So in other words, The data type is really date time. So it include, you know, month, day, and year, but also AM or PM and the time on the 24-hour clock. We're not really interested in that. We just want that to just be the date, right? So that's what this does, is it basically makes it just be the date. And so we're ignoring the time piece really. And that's also a get in the set. And then the price is a decimal number. And why decimal? Because it allows for floating point characters, right? Prices are often like, you know, $24.99 or whatever. All of them have getters or setters. This is the model for our data. I'm doing a Control S to save. And that's in the models folder. I'm just putting it out there because I know if this happens to people, if you're creating this and you accidentally put that model not in the models folder, you can move it in there. You can just, you know, grab it and drag it in, and it will move. It might throw you some errors though in the process, which you might have to correct. And notably, it would be probably here in the namespace, right? Because you're moving, let's say, from one folder to another, and you might have to append models to it so that it namespaces correctly. The other thing I'm going to do here is I'm noticing that this got changed, right? So I'm going to go ahead and do a save all here. I just want all my stuff to be saved. All right, so that's a little explanation here, right? So they talk about basically what I just talked about. And once again, the question mark after the string indicates the property is nullable. And if you want to read up on that, you can do that here. Now, if you guys ever ran a Java application and you got one of those null pointer errors, right? Like because you didn't have data in something, this is kind of related to that kind of concept. All right, let's move on to the next piece, which I think is really one of the power pieces here. When we start working with MVC and we start working with data models, this concept of scaffolding. So let's think first about that word, you know, like at what point, like if I'm like, let's say I'm painting my house, right? At what point do I switch from, let's say, you know, working with a ladder, right? Or a long stick and a paintbrush to switching to a scaffold. And what does the scaffold actually bring to me? Well, it brings to me the capability of working on a higher level without having to fear falling off the ladder or reaching beyond where I can reach. Here, what scaffolding means is the ability to automatically create pages relative to CRUD operations, which are common in working with data. So in other words, if I have a data model for movies, and then I want to scaffold out all the tools I need to work with the movies in a database, well, I would want to be able to create, read, update, and delete, right? Or destroy, whatever you call that. And I could create the pages that make all those actions happen. So in other words, I can make forms and links and scripts and all that stuff to make all that happen. It's doable, right? If you want to manually code it. But the concept is kind of like, why would you do that if you can make it happen automatically? So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to go first to create a folder. So under the pages folder, we're going to create a movies folder. So let's do that step first. I'm going to click on pages. I'm going to right click, add new folder. I'm going to call it movies. I'm pretty sure, yeah, movies, plural, right? All right, so that's where the movies folder is located. The next step, all right, well, we named it. Then we're going to right click and then we're going to add a new scaffolded item, and they show you the screenshot of it, and I will kind of do that step. So, and then once you do the scaffolded item, we're going to make a selection. So I'll show you how that works. So right click that movies folder, remember subfolder of pages, add new scaffolded item. All right, and it brings up this interface. Now we are working with Razer pages, so it's important that you click on Razer in the little sidebar here. And then it tells us, right, I don't want to go empty here. I'm not using the entity framework for the reasons I explained before. but I am going to use this one that allows me to do the CRUD operations. And notice what it does. It says generates Razer pages using entity firmware for create, delete, details, edit, and list operations for the given model, right? So in other words, it's going to attach to our model and give us all the pages we need to do CRUD, right? So that's what we're going to choose. So I'm choosing add, and then this interface will come up. So if you click the drop down here on the first box, this is where we're going to choose our model class. And this is why you pre-create your model, right? So if you have the model pre-created, the structure of what data you're working with, all I have to do is select it, right? Then we have to choose the database context class. And this is where you won't find it listed on the dropdown, but if I hit the plus button, it will automatically generate a new data context type based on the project name and then data Razer pages movie context. Just go ahead and click add, right? That's a mouthful. You won't want to type that in. The database provider is going to be SQL Server. And that's going to be, just to be clear on this, once again, if you have SQL Server installed and running on your computer, it'll try to attach to that, right? Otherwise, it's going to build a local copy of the database. And I don't know if they really kind of mention that here, right? Yeah, you just go with SQL Server. And then just go with the defaults here. It is going to use a layout page and it's just going to use the default one. But if I had my own, I'm just like kind of putting it out there, maybe I have a website where I have 10 different layouts, depending on what part of the website I'm on, I could direct it to a specific page, right? So that, hey, when you're in the movie area, it's got a movie layout, right? As opposed to the general website layout. And that would be selectable here if you had that created. So I'm going to go ahead and click add here. And then you see from the screen, it's installing more NuGet stuff. It's updating dependency information. You notice that here in the, I'm not sure which file this is. This is the probably app settings or something. It updated a whole bunch of stuff. Now it's generating a whole bunch of additional code, and we're just letting it do its work. And then you'll notice here under the movies folder, if you expand it, all of a sudden I have another index page. I have an edit, details, delete, and create. And you see me clicking on all of them. And you'll notice that with each one of those, that you'll see the Razer directives at the top, right? This tells Razer that, hey, this is page content. This is stuff that you inject into that layout. This tells .NET that we are building based on a model. Here's where it is. It's under pages, under movies, and that's where it goes. And then we also have this little directive here where this will take information and inject into the title tag of the layout page. That's kind of a weird one, but just to kind of give you the conception here on the layout page where I have a title, notice that there's a Razer directive that's pulling in the view data title and then adding just plain old text to the end of it. Well, this is what's being injected, index. Well, that's not really very helpful. So I could customize that if I wish, right? And actually we will later. But generally, any of these pages have the stuff that we need on them in order to do what we're doing. So the index page will simply create, notice, a table, right? It looks like we will have a link, right? This is an anchor tag, right? To create a new link. Then we will have a table that will display the name, the title of the movie, the release date, the genre, and the price of the movie. And then there'll also be these areas here where we're injecting Razer stuff. So if the stuff's already there, it will pull the content in and drop it into the form. And then it will create a series of links with each entry that allow us to edit, look at the details, or delete. So this is going to basically create a listing of movies that we have in our database and give you clickable access to all the CRUD operations, right? And so if I was to dig into any of these pages, I can see, for example, what is the process for editing? What is the process for the details? What is the process for deleting? And it pre-creates the forms and all the tools you need. Now, think about that. That's pretty amazing. And I wanted to put an adjective in there, and I thankfully blocked that from happening. The other piece that they're kind of pointing out here is in the app settings JSON. You will notice now that we have a database connected, that there is a connection string for the database. So now if you were connecting to a live database, whether on your own system or externally, right, it would have the connection string for doing that listed here. This very clearly shows that we're working with a local database, so it's pretty common for development. And then it creates whatever variables it needs to make it work. All done automatically. So very powerful. So they go through and they talk about what was created. I think we already did that. So it creates create, delete, details, edit, and index. It also creates the data Razer pages movie context.cs page. So let's go look at that really quick. So there is a data folder now, and it has Razer pages movie context.cs. And then what it does here is it gives you the format for how the data is basically presented and are stored within those files. Now it says the created files are explained in the next tutorial. Well, I kind of explained some of them to you now. Sorry. All right. Now, they're also making a point that when we did the scaffolding, it also added some code to the program file. I'm just going to look at it here rather than bopping over to Visual Studio, but it added all of this stuff highlighted in green. So it did add entity framework, the core of it. It added dependency injection, which we need. And then it also added that data structure from that data folder, right? That's what these using statements do. It also added here the database context for the Razer pages. And I know that this is kind of cutting off here, but it basically still is trying to work with the database. It also has exception handling built in if it's not connecting. Like sometimes that does happen, but that was added to that file. All right. I think that we're at a really logical stopping point here. So I'm going to take a break and pause the video. So we're going to do about a 5-minute break here. All right. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to keep rolling forward here. So we're on this part now that says create the initial database schema using EF's migration feature. So when we talk about, what is, and maybe that's kind of a good search, like what the heck is a database schema? And per Google's AI, it's a blueprint that describes the logical structure of a database, including how data is organized and stored. Right. So it's like the plan for the database. So now you can see, like, in a sense, when we were looking at our model, right? So when we look at this file, it might not seem like we're kind of planning a database, but there is this correlation between objects and classes, the data structure of an object, and how that correlates to a database table. So for example, you could easily see that I could have a database table that would have an ID field that's numeric, a title that's a string, a date, a genre that's a string, and a price that's a decimal. And those could all be columns in one database table. So this really does give me that structure. And, that I think makes a little bit stronger connection between like what a model is and how it ties into a database. Now, what we're going to do here, which is kind of interesting, is we're going to take the model file. We're going to run from the NuGet package manager console, right? You're going to see this. We're going to do what we call a migration, right? So the first thing is we do the migration, which looks at the models, however many we have. So it could be one model, it could be 20 models in our models folder. The migration looks at those model files and then builds tables based upon those files. And then we do the update database command, which then basically does the structural like build of it, or in other words, it executes the SQL code. So the first part is like it creates the SQL code, and the second part is it executes it basically. All right, so let's follow these steps. So we're going to go to the tools menu, select NuGet package manager, and bring up the console. And the console, of course, is the command line here. So we're going to bring up that console, and it looks kind of like this. Now I'm going to expand this on purpose so we can see the messages that are happening as they happen. But the command is add dash migration initial create. If you want, you can copy it. Look, but we're going to do one command at a time, by the way. So type that in. Now, interestingly, when I did this earlier today, I did something like this. I mistyped it and I hit enter, and I'm like, oh my God, what did I do wrong? Oh my God, this is going to fail. You know, get that red text in there. So one of the reasons the copy paste is to avoid that error. But the command is add dash migration initial create. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter on this. You can see it's build started. That's a good sign, by the way. Build succeeded. Throws up some stuff in yellow. Right. And it's got a couple of issues with some of the way that the data is structured. But we're not worried about that. These are yellow, not red. So it'll still work. Okay. Interestingly, it is possible to actually remove the migration too. So there's commands that kind of let you manipulate it, and they're all command line commands, by the way. Right. The next command was to update the database. So capital U, capital D with a dash in between. So update dash database, and then press enter. Once again, doing the same work. You can see it did a whole bunch of stuff. And if you want to scroll, this is where it gets, I think, a little bit interesting. You want to look at what the command is actually doing, right? And it talks about you know, the different data types here. Now, see, one of the problems it runs into is I can call something an integer, or I can call something an int32, for example, in C#, which are different types of integers. And then there's also, different other types of various data that have subcategories, and like I said, with the date time, for example, where you can just have the date, or you can have the date and the time, or just the time, or, whatever. What's, I think, fascinating about that is it shows you what commands it's throwing out there. Why does not look familiar, right? Create database. And then it has some other code that it runs, and et cetera, et cetera. And it finally gets down to the point where it's actually creating the table, including primary keys. Notice how it's going into like if you know your database stuff, right? Well, it kind of looks like the SQL that you learned, but this is nvarchar. It's like up to 150 characters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it shows you what SQL commands it's creating and then executing in order to put data in there. And then, ultimately, supposedly we have a database, right? So it built the database, albeit blank, right? There's nothing in it right now. So, but it did create the database, and it created a table with all the columns as well. All right, so let's go back to the tutorial now and kind of look at this really quickly, in terms of the command, and they explain them here. So this is an argument used to name the migration. Any name can be used. So the initial create is like whatever, but what they're telling you is every time you do a migration, it becomes named. So, the initial one would maybe be like, number one. I would probably choose the number, especially if I'm doing it multiple times. But when you actually do run the update database command, it runs them, and it actually timestamps the file and adds a CS, which creates the actual database. So in other words, it writes a C# script, which then executes and then actually does the database creation. That's really what it's telling you. They do talk about if you get any errors and what those errors mean. So like one of the errors that we were getting was no type of specified, you know, and what they're saying is because we're not really specifying it specifically, some of the values might be truncated. So in other words, if I put in values that don't make sense, for that data type, or if I start typing in letters where I should be putting in numbers, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all handled by that. The other interesting piece of this is they start looking at the data context. And so there's this thing that was created here, right? And if you look at that, it will be kind of under the data area, right? And it creates this file which sets up that context. Notice also now we have the migrations folder. We didn't do that. The tools did that. So here's that initial create file. Here's the code that creates the SQL for as complicated as that is. And then here is the, I guess the snapshot file of what work it did. And then it made some guesses as to some of the stuff. And all of it automatic. And you know what, for the most part, that'll work in most scenarios, by the way. They do a little bit of explaining here, but now it's time to run it and test it. So this is where it gets a little bit more fun. Now, we will run the app, but it does make a point that you need to go to the movies subfolder. And I want you to notice that they're kind of doing two things here. Here they're saying append capital M movies to the URL. And here it shows you that it's taking you to a lowercase m movies once it's executed, right? And they also make the point of if you get this in the console when it's running, right, that means you never migrated. So you may have done step one of the migration, but not step two, which is update the database. All right, so let's go ahead and run it. Back over to the Visual Studio here. I am doing a click on the project root, Control F5. There it is, loaded up. This is the index page, by the way, but they want us to append /M movies. And there it is. And check it out. There's nothing in there, right? Well, yeah, nothing in there. Why? Because we never put anything in there. So it's doing exactly what we told it to do. However, notice that we have, well, we don't have an ID column. I guess, so who cares really? But we do have the title, the release date, the genre, and the price, kind of like it's a table. There's just no data inside of it. Okay, so I think if you read the next instruction here, right, is they want you to create a thing. So I'm gonna do that. So back over, I guess I never needed to leave the browser, be in the right tab. I'm going to go ahead and click create new. Let's come up with some titles here. Let's do Star Wars. Oh gosh, all I know is I was in junior high school at the time, so maybe we can. Yeah, we're not going to go forward through the years. We're going to go back through the years. When did that movie come out? I'm just going to guess, like 77. Whatever. I'm just picking a date. Right? Doesn't really matter. Let's call it science fiction, maybe even action adventure, right? And the price for it is, I don't know, $24.99. Right, so there it is. And notice it's stuck, right? So that's good. Let's do another one, right? Let's try to think of like something maybe a little bit more recent. I can't think of it because I don't go out to see movies anymore, so I can't think of one. How about okay, let's maybe not so recent. Let's do like Toy Story, for example. And heck, if I know the release date, but I'm just going to do like a 03/22. When did that come out? Like 1995 or something, 1994, something like that. Genre, um, let's just call it adventure, or how about animated, right? And then price on that is $35. So there you go. So now you see the create part of the CRUD is certainly working, right? So it's allowing me to input information and putting it on the screen. Now, of course, you could just say to yourself, well, I can just do that with JavaScript, right? I can't really, necessarily store it, without a database or an external file. Now, can I edit these? All right, well, let's create another new one. And this time, let's just create kind of a nonsense one. We'll choose whatever date I click on here. We'll make up a imaginary genre of nonsense characters and a steep price. So if I want to edit this one, right, it gives me the interface. Now remember, I didn't create any of this stuff, right? Some movie I just created for no reason is the name of my movie. The genre is the super cools genre, and I'm dropping the price to $99 and I'm saving it. And did it stick? Yeah, all of that stuff stuck, right? What if I click the details link? Well, then it takes me into the record and I can just see, well, the same stuff basically in a different format, but you could imagine that maybe this might reveal additional information, right? Like you might have maybe screenshots or trailers or text about the movie. Yeah, that could all be possible. And then, of course, if I don't like this silly movie, I could hit delete. It puts it up on the screen and asks me if I'm sure. And I'm going to say, yes, I'm sure. So I'm going to delete it. And then I come back. And of course, it is gone. Right. And so I'm verifying all the CRUD operations work. So I want you guys to make sure that all of yours are working. So I'm going to pause here first.
Yep.
All right. So here we go. So now that everybody's seemingly working okay with all those CRUD operations, you make a little note here about the decimal in the price field, right? So they do want us to test everything. I think I proved that they all work, right? But they also want us to take a look at the stuff that was basically added by the scaffold, right? So they kind of highlight once again that it uses this connection string here, right? And that's a really important piece, right? All right, we're going to move on now to the scaffolding. So this is part 3. Now, a lot of what's happening here, and I'm just kind of pointing this out, is they're showing you when I hit that tool that did the scaffolding, what it really did, because it is really, frankly, very powerful. From a conceptual standpoint, having an engine where you can throw a structure of data at it, trigger a script that builds the database and the tables, and also builds a conglomeration of pages with all the CRUD operations pre-populated that work with all of the fields and all of the entries. And then if you take and do a comparison to how we did that in like the Java 2 class, or if you're in the Java 2 class right now, we're just hitting that segment where we have to manually create all this stuff in code. It is really a conceptual difference, right? Now, okay, so can you do MVC and scaffolding in Java? Well, the answer is, of course, yes, right? But you don't really have an appreciation for how powerful this is unless you have done the manual way and then see the automatic way, right? And so why do we use MVC? Why do we use scaffolding? Because it does a ton of work quickly, accurately. And, you know, why wouldn't you? Right, is really kind of what it comes down to. All right, so they start going through and explaining how it created an index file for the movies. So this is the one that shows a list of all the movies, right? And this is the code for it. It makes a point of saying that the model for the page, right? You know, when you're pulling in the models, this reads from a superclass called page model, by the way. And then that allows us to take the database content and automatically just push it out on a page. Now, I could think of, for example, holy cow, a whole bunch of different ways I could utilize this pretty simply, right? So what if I wanted to just build like a web page where, you know, like you guys might know, like I have a collection of guitars, you know, probably way too many for any human being really to ever play, but I still like collecting them. I could make a web page where every time I buy one, I could store it in a web app in a database online with a web front end. Wow, right? And I could make a website out of it, and then I could have that database like automatically feed the website, so I can like maybe attach a blog to it and go, hey, check out my new whatever I just bought, and then it's in the database. I can enter my stuff in. It can propagate to the front end of the website. I mean, how cool is that, right? I mean, there's so many possibilities. One thing I will make you do in your final project is to basically do what we just did here, but you have to conceptualize your data model, what data you're feeding in, and then allow the user to query it and pull results back. Right? You will make it look nice. All right. So they talk about that whole piece of using the page model, and that is used over and over again. The other thing that they're looking at here is, you know, like in the create file, how they're, you know, on posting something asynchronously, what it returns. And then after it's done, then it basically pushes you back to the index page. It shows you how it's putting the stuff on the screen. So this is kind of actually a interesting view of Razer that we're starting to delve into here a little bit. And I don't know if they give us a link to the Razer syntax here. But anytime, once again, like I said, whenever you're seeing that @ symbol on a Razer page, this is a what we call a Razer directive, right? So it's, in other words, it triggers Razer to do something. And you'll notice here, okay, so we have a table that we're creating. This is the head of the table. And then there's, you know, basically 4 columns in the table. Well, 5, this one's blank, but whatever. And the Razer directive is to create some HTML that has a display name for what comes from our model in the price column. You know, so go to the table, find the price column, and then give me a display name for it to put at the top of the column. That's what this does, right? So then if you look here, when we get to here, now all of a sudden we have like this really weird aspect, which is like now we're doing a for each loop inside of our HTML code, if you will, right? So this is a Razer directive. And I'm going to say probably the most direct correlation I have with this format might be JSP from Java, right? Where you can take Java commands, interject them into your HTML, and then have HTML sitting there too at the same time. This is exactly what we're doing here. We're just using Razer syntax instead. So in other words, it's going to look at all the data in your movie model table. And then for each one of those things, it's going to write HTML to display the title related to that record, right? So it's going to go to title, release date, genre, and price. It's reading it from the model. It keeps looping until we're through all the data. And then at the end of each column, it also gives you the edit details and delete links automatically. I didn't create those, right? The scaffolding created that. But that also explains why we had a blank column here, you know, because if you're offering up edit options, They don't need to be on the header, right? You don't want to edit, delete, and details in the header. So that would be blank. Now, if you're curious about Razer syntax, right? So I followed this link here. You can go in here and take a look at this. But whenever you see that @ sign, it's always followed by some sort of Razer keyword. And it will basically trigger code, So for example, you can walk through these references here and look at all the different stuff, right? And see what it does. So this is pretty comprehensive and talks about a lot of different things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it right now because my goal here is not to teach you Razer, it's to teach you how to work with ASP.NET. A lot of the stuff happens automatically, so I'm like keeping that in mind, right? So like you're adding tools and it just automatically throws in the right directive. But if you're at the point where you're custom writing these things, yeah, you would dive into a reference like this, but this explains what they all do. All right, back over to the main piece here. All right, so they're starting to talk here about, we have this page directive, right? So if we look at any one of our Visual Studio pages, right, up at the top, what this is telling us is, hey, this is a page. This page gets injected into that layout, right? Now, we're also declaring the model. So like if we're feeding data into these Razer fields, which model are we pulling it from? And this specifies. So we go to the, the namespace, basically, the folder, and then we're looking at the index model, right? And the index model will then, declare which model, right? And then which field. So, so these are kind of necessary pieces. And it should also give you this idea that you can have more than one data model. And if you think about how databases are, you can have multiple tables. So for every table, you're going to have a model, right? Yeah, so that can get pretty complex. So if you're pulling from a different model, then you would declare a different one here that would be appropriate for the object that you're working for. It also, I'll tell you what, it also explains a little bit why we created a subfolder here. I didn't really need to do that, right? Because all of this stuff could have ended up in the root of the application. But if I do have different areas with different tables and different data, it makes sense to keep them separate, right? So if I had a movies database, maybe I'll have a guitars database, or whatever. Those would have their own folders and all their own CRUD operations, right? So logical. All right. All right. They talk about also the use of the lambda expressions here to kind of pull in stuff from the models, and I think I've talked about that enough already. Also, how that stuff gets injected into the layout page. I think we've talked about that enough already. I think I also did a little snippet on this, right? So here's another Razer directive that allows you to basically push title data, right, into the layout page, so I can customize what goes into the page. Now, the one thing I will tell you, right? So if this is running and it's on the list of movies, calling that page index, this is what it did automatically with the scaffolding, is kind of lame. What should it really say? Well, movies comes to mind, because it's a movies table, right? So instead of just saying index, that might be better named something else. I think that's where the tutorial goes next. Let's see if that's the case. So the title property is used in the layout page, right? So they're showing you, so this basically index will get injected here, right? And then of course, title. All right, so let's look at that really carefully. Title also refers to the name of what pops up on the tab. So I get index dash Razer pages movie. Not so great, right? So you can tweak this, is the point. All right, so we're going to update the layout. So we're going to go to the layout.cs page and we're going to switch it so that the default text that always pops up is movie instead of whatever we called it, Razer Pages movie, right? So let's go to that layout.cs page and make that change. Might have it open, but I hate looking for it, so I just come back here and click on it. If the tab's open, it pops forward. So we're going to change this, and we're just going to say movie, right? So do a Control S and save that one. And now it says find the following anchor element in the same file, right? And replace it with the following markup. So I want you to, like, first you got to find this anchor tag with the class navbar brand. So let's go find that. And here you go, class navbar brand. So they're talking about this tag, basically. They want us to replace this tag. But let's look really carefully at what they want us to replace it with. So what they're going to do here is, you know, instead of providing a link that says for the index page or the home page, Razer Pages movie, right? So if you look here and you go there, I mean, that's what they're talking about. We instead want to have it go to movies index, and then it's going to say RP movie, right? So we can control, you know, the point of this is we can control these things. So I'm going to change first the link. So it's going to be movies index, and we start with the / movies index, and then this is going to say RP movie. All right, I'm not really too crazy about that, but hey, you know, it is what it is. RP movie. I'll just go with what they're doing just to be consistent. So save. All right, so we made the change. So we really didn't replace it. We just put that in. Now I'm noticing there's an attribute here that was blank before that's still there, and I don't think that really matters, honestly. So if you want, you could remove that. I think it's not inconsequential. All right, moving along. All right. All right, so all right, save the changes and test the app by selecting the RP movie link and see the change. Now, what I would do suggest is if you do have the tab open right now, close it. I'm going to go ahead and relaunch. So Control F5. I'm not clicking on the project root here, so we'll see what it launches to. It should still launch to the right spot. There it is. So I'm going to go to the RP movie page, and I want you to notice as I'm hovering here, down here in the address bar indicator, it is going to go to the movie page. So it's not going to index anymore. But now this is still saying index, but it does take me there, right? So that does seem to work. And it says test the home RP movie, create, edit, and delete links. Each page sets the title, which you can see in the browser tab. Okay, I guess I didn't look at that, right? So the index page says index movie. So if I click on, let's say, Star Wars, so it says details movie, so details movie, right? Better, I think a little bit better. Back to the list. If I do an edit, it says edit movie. If I do details, it says details. If I do delete, it says delete. Back to list. Okay, so you see that we've had a little bit of impact on the title here, and we're able to change the menu bar option, so to speak. All right. Now, they are making a point that the layout property ultimately is set in this file here, the view start. So I'm going to go to that page here, and that's under pages, and you see they have a view start, and it designates which layout we're using when we start out, and it's using the layout, which is, you know, the file that we have here. Right? So that is pre-designated. So if you wanted, once again, you could redirect to a different layout if you wanted, right? Depends on what thing you're hitting. The next thing they do is they start looking at this file here. So pages, movies, create CSHTML CS page. And it shows you all the code that was used to basically create the page model. So we can just take a really quick look at that. And that was movies. So this code here shows us the create operation and how that works. And you know, it's not hard to figure out, but basically they start going through all the different key functions here. So I would ask you to read up on some of this, but it tells you what some of these methods do and how they return things. And so, you know, if the model is valid, it returns the page. Otherwise, it redirects you back to home. Is kind of what this says. They go through the create page, right? And if you look at the create page, I want you to look at all the little aspects here. So they have kind of basically separate little divs here that handle the title, right? You see all that stuff in here. Notice these specialized ASP attribute tags here, right? Intermingled with standard HTML ones. And one for title, one for release date, one for genre, one for price, right? And that's, they just want you to look at it and understand where it is controlled from and how it's controlled. What's kind of interesting also about this is when you look at the main page here, right? So they're having you look at, you know, the form uses post, right? So we can't see the data in transit. You know, they have approaches for building validation here. They have approaches for labeling items, for getting input from items, and then also, once again, doing validation. Again. So they kind of give you, I think, a pretty comprehensive view of all the little subcomponents here. What I would encourage you to do is read through this content carefully. I mean, I could read it to you from the screen, but I don't really see much of a point on that. But it tells you, you know, what, you know, why they're using like these tools, for example, like ASP validation summary and validation 4, and what that gives you, right? This just shows you error messages that things aren't validating. Validation is a separate process, right? So that's going to be a next week kind of thing for us. All right, so we're good, I think, with this page. So we're going to move on at this point to working with the database. And once we get through this page, we are done for the day, by the way. All right. So one kind of really interesting aspect of this is as we're kind of adding this stuff, and you know, in some ways it feels uncomfortable. And I say this from like a person who learned how to code pretty much everything manually. When I'm using a tool and it automatically builds stuff, because then I feel like I've lost control, right? But it's kind of that same feeling that you get when you go from like a manual transmission vehicle to an automatic. It's kind of okay, right? I don't have to worry about shifting. Now I can eat my sandwich while I'm driving a lot easier. You know, and you get this like trust that you have to have with how the tools work and how you need to manipulate those tools that create the automatic content to get the stuff that you want, right? They're talking here about how when we're adding the database connectivity, and this line adds that dependency injection piece so that we can work with it. And then if there's errors, it handles the errors too. And you know, when we're doing that connection to the database, that it does add the server connection piece. We already looked at this piece, so I'm kind of going through it a little bit fast. But once again, because we're working with this piece and it's working locally, that's the connection string for it. And the one that you automatically created should be very, very, very similar, right? A couple little differences because of date timestamps or whatever. And then once again, if you are working with a live production database or a remote database, that connection string, once it's working, would get stored inside of your app as well. So now, normally when we're working with Visual Studio and we're using the internal database, so, and this is pretty important to explain here, I think, right? Once again, you have two options really. You're running a local instance of SQL Server, unlikely for most of our students at this point. Some legacy students might still have that, or you're a real geek and you just run SQL Server on your machine. But most often we're going to go to that local database. And you know, the fact that we even have that as an option, it's kind of interesting. In the old days when I used to teach this, I would have to teach people to both install a separate product. So in the old days, we would install SQL Server Express and install Visual Studio so they could work together. And then later on, they got smart and said, oh, why don't we just build SQL Server Express into Visual Studio and then it's all done. And that is really kind of the preferred way to work. What they make a point of saying is when you are working with a local database, it does create an MDF file. And I think that stands for Microsoft Database File, and it stores it in your users directory. All right, so I'm going to actually go there for a second. And of course, this will be different on a Mac or a Linux machine, but if you are on a Windows machine, go to your C drive, go to your user directory, go to your user account, right? And then somewhere inside here, and see right here, you can look at the timestamps too, right? We just did it. Here's the MDF file, right? That was created. So this is the database that I just made. And then there's also a log file for that database. And they're stored here in your user directory. Why? That's just where it puts it. So, you know, in other words, the database file can be transported because there it is, right? You can copy it, you can move it around, but it does store it as an actual file. If you were working with a live database, it wouldn't work like that. You're just reading and writing to the database. All right, one thing that they do want us to do here, so inside the product is they want us to go to the view menu and find the SQL Server Object Explorer. So I'm going to do that, over to Visual Studio, View, and there it is, SQL Server Object Explorer, which then will open up a sidebar here, right, that shows us our databases. And you'll notice has a couple of them listed, right? And I think it's pretty obvious that we're going to use this one because it says local database, right? So let's go ahead and click that. But let's look at their tutorial here just to make sure, right? Local database, you know, local DB, that's the one we want to click on. And inside of there, as you hit the little triangle, you'll notice there's a database entry. So we'll expand that. And then we're also going to notice here all the different local databases that we have available. And once again, I was experimenting with this earlier. So these two are my earlier experiments, right? But the one that I created today matches the data model name or the project name, right? So I know it's which one it's attached to. Then it has this long gobbledygook string, which is really a time date stamp, I think, by the way. And then from there, I can expand that and then expand the tables. And then inside the tables folder, I will see DBO movie, right? All right, so that's kind of where they get us to. And then they want us on top of that DBO movie to right click and view the designer. So I'm going to right click and then view designer. What this will open up is kind of a structural view of that database table. So it tells you the name of the columns. Notice the little key right there. That's our primary key. So you use your database terminology. It tells you the data type. And then The ones that allow nulls, if you remember the two string fields with the question marks after them, those allow nulls, right? So that's all translated into the database structure. So what we're looking at here is the database table structure, right? And if you look down below, you'll also notice, hey, wow, that looks like SQL code because, hey, guess what it is, right? And this shows you the, in essence, the code you would run within a SQL environment to create this. But C# did it for us and we didn't have to execute it, right? So I think this is really cool. It shows you exactly how it's built. Now, of course, you probably have the question, if I wanted to change this, let's say I wanted to, change the capacity or the decimal format or whatever that happens to be. Yeah, I could tweak this both either from the designer up here or from down here and then re-execute it, remigrate it technically. But this shows you the structure. The other thing that's kind of interesting is if you right click on the movie table and select view data. So we have to go back to the SQL Server Object Explorer. And I don't know if you can see it here on my sidebar, but when I went into the design view, it kind of collapsed it down, but I'm going to re-expand it. And if you want, you could actually pin it here so it always stays open. But I'm going to do a right click and then view data. And what this does is it transports me into the actual database file and is reading the data back on the screen. And I don't think I can zoom in on this, so I apologize. But if you can see this well enough, you will notice that this is the stuff that I entered. Notice like the date timestamp does still have a timestamp on it. It just kind of ignores the time. It just captures the date. But there's all the information. Pretty cool, right? Now, what is kind of weird about this is it's telling you that Visual Studio kind of has some of the same capabilities as tools that you use to manipulate databases. So if you were using, for example, MySQL Workbench to write SQL scripts, look at table contents and run reports and stuff, well, you can do that inside of Visual Studio. I can look at the tables, I can run SQL code, I can connect to the database, all that stuff right here. If you've ever used SQL Server Management Studio, what you will also notice is that that is basically a version of Visual Studio that's built just to do database work. And so there's correlations between the products. So this is a really powerful aspect of Visual Studio that a lot of other IDEs lack, real frankly. Well, better ones do have these types of tools, but the fact that you can not only create data models, scaffold out a bunch of pages, connect to a database, read and write, design the database, access the data directly, like, oh my God, right? I mean, you can do a lot here is kind of the point. Right. The next thing that we're going to do, and this is where we're going to cap it, is we're going to seed the database. Now, this is really kind of an interesting thought, right? Because if I'm propagating an application and I want it to travel with data to start with, I can create a file that will contain the database information that we put into the database and have it done automatically. And so it says create a new class named seed data in the models folder with the following code. So they're giving us the code, but let's go ahead and well, first of all, let's copy all that code. And then I'm going to go to Visual Studio here. I'm going to go to the models folder. I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a new class file. And they want it called seed data, capital S, capital D, no spaces. And I'm hitting add. Right now, what I'm going to do, assuming that my namespace matches up and I'm looking at it really carefully and my class name matches up, I'm just going to highlight all this and I'm going to paste in all that code. So hopefully no red underlines. If you have a red underline, please let me know and I'll help guide you through it. Where you would get a red underline most typically in this situation is if you didn't name the project exactly the same, you didn't name the models exactly the same or any of the files the same, it would break, right? You would get underlines, but they are correctable. You just have to change the names to the right thing. So if you name it Razer Pages Movies, you would add an S here to fix it. Or if you named your models folder, well, I don't think you want to name that something else, but if you name like your movie CS file, I don't know, with a lowercase m or something like that, you could tweak it and fix it. Right, so here's the file. I'm going to do Control S to save. Right, so we have that capability. And I want you to look at what it's doing. Is they're adding, these movies, right, with pre-populated with data. However, there is an if statement here, right? If there's any movies already in the database, it's not going to populate the movies, right? So here's what we're going to do. If you have Visual Studio still up and running and you have your data still up on the screen, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to go to the live data and I'm going to right click over here on the sidebar and I'm going to delete each database entry because I want to start out with a blank table. Because if I don't, then when I run the seed thing, it's not going to seed those movies in, right? It just wouldn't. It would just give me back Star Wars and whatever I had. What's the other one? Whatever. Toy Story and Star Wars. It would have gave me back. But now I'm clearing them from here. All right. So that's the seed. And they make a point of saying that. So like if there's any movies already in there, it's just going to return. It's not going to do anything. So don't do that. The other thing that we have to do is we have to go into the Program.cs file and add the code that's highlighted green. So I'm going to grab this first line and then I'll talk about it as I paste it in. So I'm going to go to Program.cs and then I'm going to add a using statement here. And basically what this does, and you can read it, right? It goes into our namespace. It goes into my models folder and says, hey, whatever stuff I have in that models folder, you can use that, right? So sort of demystifies what a using statement is a little bit. It's just saying, hey, you can go here and grab some stuff if you want. Okay. So we got to throw that in. Right now, grayed out because we're not really using it yet. But then here, we will grab this using statement that is kind of embedded in the code. And it goes right under the var app builder build thing. So right here, we'll paste that in. And hopefully, once again, no red underlines. If you do have red underlines, please stop me in my tracks here so we can fix it. If not, do a Control S to save. This so far so good. Everything seems to be working great, and there's no other additions to make. Right now, what we're doing, right? It says we're getting context from dependency injection container. We are going to call this initialize function to get the seed data, and then we're going to dispose of that context, right? If you get an error message like this, once again, you need to update your database, right? Which means you migrated but never built it. Okay, so we're going to test it now. Let's see what happens. So if I did this correctly, I'm going to close any running tab, back over to Visual Studio, and Control F5 to run. Here it goes. So far, so good. No crashes. I'm going to hit the RP movie thing, which takes me to the movies list, and check it out, folks. It did take the seed data, which built into the database. So my Star Wars entry and my Toy Story entry are now gone. All of these are in there. I assume like the dates are relatively correct. I can still add stuff to it, edit, delete, and all that, or at least hypothetically. Now, I'm not sure if this has me test it further. I guess we should probably read the instructions. Right, and so they make a point. If the database isn't seeded, put a breakpoint on a specific line of code to see what's happening, and then step through the code. For us, it worked. I would encourage you at this point, by the way, I mean, you should be screenshotting any of the success points, honestly. is in the running version of the app, try adding an entry. So if you want to go back to Star Wars, right? You want to, I'm just throwing in a random release date, random, not so random category and price, and I'm hitting create, and there it is added. I can pull up the details. I can edit. Well, I didn't edit anything, so why don't we edit something? Let's edit the price. Make it really cheap. And then, of course, we can delete it if we wish, and it's all working. All right. So I'm going to call this a successful tutorial for today, right? This is part one of a two-parter. We're going to do the other steps. And, you know, if you're wondering, the other steps are do some page updates, adding a search feature, adding another field, and then adding validation to the whole process. All right, so this video will end here. Remember to subscribe if you're into that kind of thing. And if you have questions or problems, please email me, and I will provide a link to the tutorials in the description box at the bottom, you know, when I get to that point. All right, this video ends here.